Welcome to the northeast of England. If you're joining me for the first time, hi, I'm Caroline and I'm spending a week going on adventures in the area of England that I grew up in. In the last episode, I went on a rainy circular hike through the North Pennines, taking in 4 stunning waterfalls. Today, however, I'll be visiting Vindolanda. It's a Roman fort and army museum nestled between the North Pennines and Northumberland National Park, just off the A69. Today I've come along to Vindolanda in Northumberland. It's an old Roman fort that's just a little bit south of Hadrian's wall, and it's thought that it was inhabited from 85 AD until about the 5th or 6th century AD. You can probably see the site a little bit behind me, but I'm going to have a bit of a wander around, and there's both the fort that I'm currently in and also the village alongside it. I'm going to try and find out a little bit more about what went on here and what life was like for both the people working in the fort, but also the people who worked in the businesses that popped up in the village just next door to it. Back in 2010, they did some excavation work inside of this barrack, and they actually found, to date, the only full skeleton, and it was the skeleton of a child, and you can just about see the outline of the grave in the background. It was actually illegal back then to bury people within the Roman fort, which is what we're in, or in the villages, just because of how unsanitary it was. So it is expected that some kind of illegal activity that had taken place, which is why the child was buried here. The barrack that I'm in at the moment is a standard size of a barrack, and it would house what was known as a contraburnum. That consisted of 8 soldiers. But in addition to the 8 soldiers, it had to also house all of their belongings and all of their weapons, but also quite often the soldiers would have at least one slave, so it was expected that the slave was also living in here. And sometimes their slaves could have families, so the slave's family would also be living inside of this tiny barrack. It meant that there had to be a sleeping rotation, they were having to share the beds, and obviously they needed to have very clear-cut rules as to what space belonged to who and at what time of the day they were able to use it to stop there from being disputes. The army barracks houses had incredibly thick walls, and our guide was explaining that it was to help keep the heat in during the dead of winter. But I also know that really thick walls would do the opposite, so if they did have heat waves in the summer, it also would have helped keep the heat out and keep the properties a little bit cooler. Another thing from an architectural point of view is that the doors were offset from one another to help give a little bit of privacy. But given that they were sharing these barracks with 8 other people, I find very interesting that privacy was something they were considering. The remains behind me are the prefect's house, which would have housed the commanding officer. And if you try and compare this in comparison to those barracks that were tiny to house just 8 men and their slaves, this is crazy, but it does definitely represent the hierarchy and how high up and important the commanding officer was. Commanding officer was the one person who legally at Vindolanda was allowed to marry and have children, and so naturally there is space for the wife and children, but also they would have had many servants, and then they would have invited other high-ranking officers from other forts nearby to come, and they would be entertained in this space, so they would need that entertaining space, but also places for those guests to be able to sleep as well. So the size of this is just huge in comparison, but definitely reflects the hierarchy. We've just come out of the museum, and naturally it's full of lots of artefacts that they've excavated from the site up the hill. There's a huge collection of shoes and Quite a few of the shoes were ones that women and children wore, which gives a really clear nod that it wasn't just male soldiers who were living here. What's really cool is there was one pair of shoes that were excavated from the site. Another thing that I found quite interesting was the glassware. First of all, just amazing that the glass was still intact. One of them was showing that it had come over from a part of, I think, Bavaria in Germany, and that was helping to show the wealth of the people who lived here and how they were able to have it imported over. But there was another one, it was the base of, I guess, like a glass vase or something. Very surprisingly, it had a swastika on the bottom of it. The inscription at the side within the museum was explaining that obviously back in those days, the swastika didn't have those really dark associations that we have today with it. Another thing was a couple of glass objects. One of them was two halves that they quite recently have been able to put together. They were actually found decades apart from one another, and I just imagine the elation of the archaeologists when they managed to find the other section and thinking, like, we've already got something that is going to match up to this and we're going to be able to make it a little bit more complete. They've also unearthed tablets, and they've been able to then translate some letters and just information that people had written down. And one of them was actually hand signed, even though they got a scribe to write the majority of it. One of them was hand signed by a female, and the video that I was watching in there, they were explaining that as far as they're aware in sort of Western Europe, it's the only one of its kind. When we were at the fort's barracks, one of the rooms, I talked about how they'd found the skeleton of a child, and that's also on display in the museum. Very close to what I found quite interesting, which was almost like a board game. It was a tablet, a stone tablet, but you could see the little counters or characters that people would move around, and they'd also found dice as well within the site. So it was just really nice getting to see a lot of the artefacts that they brought up. And one of the things that they were talking about as well was with regards to the costing for them to dig up and restore. And interestingly, the wooden pieces were the most expensive, often running into 4 figures per piece. This part of the site is still undergoing archaeological excavation. This morning when we arrived, there were some volunteers doing some archaeological work. It was explained to us that they will volunteer for 2 weeks at a time. You don't have to have any experience at all. You get trained up at the very start of it on how to be able to do those archaeological digs in a way that makes sure that they're not causing any damage to anything that they might come across. This wall that I'm standing next to is the very edge of the fort. So everything on this side of me, all to do with the fort and the army, and everything to this side of me was actually a village. Now the two were very strongly interlinked. Anyone who lived in the village, they didn't own their houses, they had to rent them, and they rented them from the commanding officer inside of the fort. And they had to abide by the commanding officer's rules. If the army had to move on, so did the people who lived in the village. So it had its problems, but with it came great rewards. Just like how in modern day society, if you've got an army barracks somewhere, those who work in the army, they still need everyday provisions. So local people realised that they could set up businesses such as butchers, shops, and also owning and running the Bathhouse. And of course the soldiers who lived within the army barracks here, or within the fort here, they would then go and spend their earnings in this village, reaping rewards for those who lived here.
Turn, please.
As I wander up this main street, I'm learning that a lot of coins were found that had been dropped by the residents, and they've fallen into the muck and the dirt, never to be found again until obviously archaeologists started excavating the area. It's relatively quiet. I mean, obviously more people have turned up as the day has gone on. It's very peaceful. It definitely feels like you're out in the countryside, and it's got countryside air, but apparently this place was absolutely crazy back in history when this was a working village. You were constantly definitely surrounded with a party for the senses when it came to the smells, as you had cows and chickens and goats, but you also had the fumes coming out of things like the bathhouses that were obviously heating up the water, and also some of the industrial businesses that were within this village. Whilst they did have trenches built for sewerage, sometimes it would overflow. I think that this place would have been very loud, very noisy, very smelly, and definitely not the pleasant environment that I'm seeing today. Having made our way up to the northwesterly point of the village, we've come to the Bathhouse. Whilst you would think from the name of it, it would just have been where the army men came to bathe, it was actually a whole place of coming to socialise. People would be here selling things like food, they would be able to play games, there would also be people who would give massages here, and also it seems to be the only record of a place where people could come and use the toilet or use a latrine whilst here. Behind me you might be able to see some pillars. Those are quite typical of the bathhouses, and then off to the side where those pillars are, that would probably have been where slaves were lighting a fire that would have helped to heat up the water for the baths, but also it would have heated things like the walls and the floors as well. As I walk away from the bathhouse, I've learnt through one of those things where you push a button and it talks to you that the reason why the bathhouse was in the northwest corner of the village is because the prevailing winds came from the southeast, and obviously all of the fumes that were coming out of the fire that heated up the water and the floors and the walls, and also I guess like the smell of the urine and poop and everything that were coming from the latrines, it meant that instead of having all of those really disgusting smells blowing across the village, it actually blew away into the countryside instead. We rounded off the day with a 6-mile drive along the old Roman road that Vindolanda was created to protect, to visit the Roman Army Museum. Whilst small in size, the award-winning 3D cinema film called Edge of Empire was amazing and well worth the extra cost and drive.